I found the paperwork hidden inside my son's desk drawer. Petition for involuntary guardianship. My name was on line 1. My son and his wife had been collecting evidence for months, telling doctors I was confused, writing notes about my supposed memory loss, even recording me when I was tired after taking the pills they gave me every night. But what they didn't know was that 6 weeks earlier, I had hidden a camera in the living room, and everything they said, every whisper, every plan, every lie, was recorded. Like this video, subscribe, and tell me, what would you do with that recording? The paper felt heavy in my hand, heavier than any document should feel given how thin the stock was. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and the house was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and the distant sound of a lawnmower somewhere down the street. My son David was at work at the logistics firm, and his wife Sarah was at the grocery store on the west side. They thought I was napping upstairs in the guest room they had assigned me. They thought I was too weak to walk down the hallway without my cane, too confused to remember where they kept the spare key to the home office that used to be Robert's study. But I had been teaching second grade for 35 years before I retired. I know how to find things people want to hide. I know how to look like I am not looking. I stood there in the soft light of the office, looking at the letterhead of a law firm I did not recognize. The words involuntary guardianship stared back at me like a verdict printed in black ink. They were planning to declare me insane. They were planning to take everything I had built over 72 years of life. And the strangest part was not the betrayal itself. It was the calmness of the document. It was typed neatly, signed by a doctor I had never met, and dated for next week. I placed the paper back exactly where I found it. I smoothed the corner where I had lifted it. Then I walked back to the living room, sat in my armchair, and turned on the television. I needed them to believe nothing had changed. Because what happened next changed everything I believed about my own son. I looked around the room at the photographs on the mantel. There was David at age 5 holding a fishing rod. There was David at his graduation from Ohio State. There was David standing next to me at Robert's funeral. In every picture, he was smiling. In every picture, I looked proud. I wondered when the pride had turned into pity. I wondered when the son who used to call me every Sunday to ask about my garden had become the man who hid legal petitions in his desk drawer. The clock on the wall ticked loudly. Each second felt like a hammer drop. I realized I was not sitting in my own home anymore. I was sitting in a waiting room. I was waiting for them to decide when I was no longer useful. I touched the fabric of the armchair. It was the blue velvet one Robert had bought me for our 20th anniversary. He had said it would last forever. He was wrong about the chair. He was wrong about the forever. But he was right about one thing. He always told me to keep my eyes open. He always told me that people show you who they are if you wait long enough. I had waited long enough. Now it was time to see what I could do with what I knew. I closed my eyes for a moment and listened to the house. It was settling around me. The pipes groaned in the walls. The floorboards creaked under the weight of the silence. I opened my eyes and looked at the camera lens hidden inside the ceramic vase on the bookshelf. The little red light was blinking. It was blinking like a heartbeat. It was the only thing in this house that was telling me the truth. I took a deep breath. The air smelled like lemon polish and dust. It smelled like a life that was being packed away. I stood up and walked to the kitchen to make a cup of tea. My hands did not shake. That surprised me. I thought I would be trembling. I thought I would be crying. But I felt cold, I felt focused. I filled the kettle with water from the tap. I watched the steam rise from the spout. I thought about the pills Sarah gave me every night after dinner. She said they were for my blood pressure. She said they would help me sleep. I had stopped taking them 3 weeks ago. I had poured them into the sink and watched them dissolve in the water. I wondered what they really were. I wondered if the doctor who signed the petition knew about them. I wondered how many other people were involved in this plan. The kettle whistled. I turned it off. I poured the water into my mug. I added a bag of Earl Grey tea. I walked back to the living room and sat down. I waited for the front door to open. I waited for them to come home. I waited for the lie to continue. Because I knew something they did not. I knew that the truth was already recorded. I knew that the evidence was safe. And I knew that when the time came, I would not be the one leaving this house. David moved into my house 3 months after my husband Robert passed away. He said it was for safety. He said a woman my age should not be alone in a 4-bedroom colonial on Elm Street. He said the stairs were dangerous and the yard was too big. I believed him because I was lonely. The silence in the house after Robert died was a physical weight. It pressed against my chest every morning when I woke up on the wrong side of the bed. David promised me warmth. He promised me family. He brought Sarah and their 2 children, Leo and Mia. They filled the rooms with noise and laughter. For the first few weeks, it felt like healing. But looking back now, I see the cracks were there from the beginning. It started with the pills. Sarah brought them to me in a white plastic organizer. She said the doctor wanted me to take them for my blood pressure. She said they would help me sleep better. I trusted her because she was a nurse. I trusted them because they were my blood. But Robert used to say trust is a currency you spend only once. I did not understand what he meant until I saw the bottle in the trash can behind the cabinet. It was not blood pressure medication. It was something else. Something that made my hands shake and my thoughts feel like they were moving through water. I stopped taking them when they left the room. I poured them into the sink and watched them dissolve. That small detail didn't seem important at the time. It would later change everything. The move-in day was chaotic. There were boxes everywhere. There was furniture being dragged across the hardwood floors. David told me not to worry about lifting anything. He said I should sit in the kitchen and drink my tea. I sat there and watched them carry Robert's things into the basement. They said they were storing them for safekeeping. I watched them take his tools. I watched them take his collection of first edition books. I watched them take the painting from the hallway that Robert's mother had given us. I asked David where they were going. He said they were just organizing the house. He said we would hang them back up later. They never hung them back up. The basement door was locked after the first week. Sarah said it was because of the children. She said she did not want them playing with dangerous tools. I accepted that. I accepted too much. I told myself they were helping me. I told myself I was just old and tired. But there were moments when the mask slipped. There were moments when I saw the impatience in David's eyes. There were moments when I heard Sarah whispering on the phone in the garage. She thought I was asleep. She thought the walls were thick enough to hide her voice. But old houses carry sound. They carry secrets. I would lie in bed at night and listen to the muffled tones below. I heard words like equity. I heard words like transfer. I heard words like capacity. I did not know what they meant then. I do now. I know that capacity is a legal term. I know that it means the ability to make decisions. I know that if they prove I lack capacity, they can take everything. They can sell the house. They can move me to a facility. They can cut me off from the world. Robert always said a home wasn't the walls, it was the years inside them. They were trying to erase the years. They were trying to wipe the walls clean. I walked through the halls sometimes and touched the paint. I touched the spots where we had measured David's height when he was a boy. Those marks were still there. They were faint pencil lines near the pantry door. David had not painted over them yet. Maybe he forgot. Maybe he did not care. I ran my finger over the line marked age 10. I remembered that day. It was a Saturday. Robert had made pancakes. David had spilled syrup on his shirt. We had laughed. I tried to remember the sound of Robert's laugh. It was getting harder to recall. The grief was like a fog. It made things blurry. But the anger was clear. The anger was sharp. It cut through the fog. I realized I was not protecting my memories anymore. I was protecting my future. I went to the kitchen and opened the drawer where we kept the scissors. I took a pair. I walked back to the pantry. I cut out the section of the wall with the height marks. I took it to my room. I put it under my bed. It was not much, but it was mine. They could have the house. They could have the furniture. But they would not have the memories. Not unless they took them from my cold, dead hands. And I had no intention of dying any time soon. I was 72 years old. My mother lived to be 95. I had strength in my legs. I had clarity in my mind. They just needed me to believe I did not. They needed me to act confused. They needed me to act weak. So I decided to give them what they wanted. I decided to play the part. I would be the confused old mother. I would be the forgetful grandmother. I would let them think they were winning. Because the best way to catch a predator is to let them think you are prey. I sat on the edge of my bed and looked at the piece of wall in my hands. I smiled. It was a small smile, but it was real. The game had begun, and I knew the rules better than they did. The first time I felt truly afraid was during dinner on a Thursday night. We were eating roasted chicken and mashed potatoes. The children were arguing over the last roll. David was talking about his job at the logistics firm. He sounded tired. Sarah was scrolling through her phone under the table. Then David looked at me. He did not smile. He just said, "Mum, you seem forgetful lately. Did you turn off the stove this morning?" I knew I had. I checked it twice before I left the kitchen. But I saw the way Sarah stopped scrolling. I saw the way she looked at David. It was a quick glance. It lasted less than a second. But I saw it. It was not a look of concern. It was a look of confirmation. Like they had discussed this moment before. Like they were testing me. I smiled and said, "I think I did, dear." David nodded slowly. He said, "We should probably check it together next time, just to be safe." His voice was gentle, but his eyes were cold. Something about the way he said those words made my stomach tighten. I realized then that I was not being cared for. I was being managed, like an asset that was losing value. I finished my meal in silence. I listened to the sound of the forks against the plates. I listened to the way the house settled around us. And suddenly Robert's warning echoed in my mind. Paperwork matters, Joan. Always check the paperwork. I did not know then how much those words would save me. The chicken was dry. The potatoes were cold. I pushed the food around my plate. Leo asked if he could be excused. Sarah said yes without looking up from her phone. Mia asked for dessert. Sarah said, "Not until you finish your vegetables." The dynamic was normal. The surface was normal. But underneath, something was rotting. I wiped my mouth with the napkin. I placed it on the table. I said, "I think I will go to bed early tonight. I am feeling very tired." David looked at me. He said, "Do you need help getting upstairs?" I said, "No, I am fine." I stood up. My legs felt steady. I walked to the hallway. I could feel their eyes on my back. They were watching me walk. They were looking for signs of instability. They were looking for a reason to say I could not walk alone. I put my hand on the banister. I lifted my foot to the first step. I did not hesitate. I went up the stairs slowly. I wanted them to think it was effort. I wanted them to think I was weak. When I reached the top of the landing, I stopped. I listened. I heard the chairs scrape against the floor below. I heard David say, "She is getting worse." I heard Sarah say, "The doctor said we should move quickly." I heard the clink of a wine glass being poured. They did not wait for me to leave the house. They started their planning right there at the dinner table. I walked to my room and closed the door. I did not lock it. Locks would seem suspicious. I sat on the bed and took off my shoes. I looked at my hands. They looked old. They had spots on the skin. They had veins that showed clearly. But they were strong hands. They had held chalk for 35 years. They had held Robert's hand for 42 years. They had held David when he was a baby. These hands had built a life. They were not done yet. I lay back on the pillow. I stared at the ceiling. There was a crack in the plaster above the light fixture. It had been there for 10 years. Robert said he would fix it. He never did. Now it looked like a lightning bolt. It looked like a break in the sky. I thought about the stove. I had turned it off. I knew I had turned it off. But why would David ask me that? Why would he question me in front of the children? He was planting seeds. He was planting doubt in their minds. He was making sure Leo and Mia saw their grandmother as fragile. He was preparing them for the day I would not be there anymore. He was grooming them to accept my absence. The thought made me feel sick. I turned on my side. I pulled the blanket up to my chin. I closed my eyes. I did not sleep. I listened to the house. I listened to the footsteps below. I listened to the television being turned on. I listened to the laughter that did not include me. I waited for the house to go quiet. I waited for them to go to bed. When the silence finally came, I got up. I put on my robe. I walked to the door. I opened it slowly. The hinges did not creak. I had oiled them yesterday. I stepped into the hallway. The moonlight came through the window at the end of the hall. It cast long shadows on the carpet. I walked to the top of the stairs. I looked down into the living room. The lights were off. The television was off. The room was empty. I went back to my room. I opened my nightstand drawer. I took out the small notebook I had bought at the pharmacy. I opened it to a fresh page. I wrote down the time. I wrote down what David had said. I wrote down what Sarah had said. I wrote down the look in their eyes. I closed the notebook. I put it back in the drawer. I hid it behind the box of tissues. I went back to bed. I lay there until the sun came up. I watched the light change on the wall. I watched the shadows move. I felt like a soldier in a war I did not start. But I was going to finish it. I was going to win it. Because they had made one. Mistake. They thought I was too old to fight. They thought I was too tired to care. They did not know that a mother protects her young, and they did not know that a widow protects her legacy. I was both. I was both, and I was ready. I started watching them more closely after that night. I watched how Sarah handled the mail. She began taking it from the box before I could reach it. She said she did not want me to be bothered by bills. She said she would handle everything. I let her do it. I pretended to be tired. I pretended to be confused. It was hard to act when every instinct in my body was screaming at me to run. But I am not a runner. I am a planner, just like Robert. I began keeping a notebook in my bedroom. I wrote down the times they left the house. I wrote down the names of the people who called. I wrote down every time they asked me to sign something. 3 weeks and 2 days after the dinner incident, Sarah brought me a form. She said it was for the insurance company. She said I needed to sign it so they would cover the renovations in the bathroom. The paper was thick. The font was small. I put on my reading glasses. I saw the words power of attorney near the bottom. I looked at Sarah. She was smiling, but her fingers were tapping on the table, a nervous rhythm. I said, I need to think about this, dear. She stopped tapping. Her smile did not reach her eyes. She said, there is no rush, Mum, but we should do it soon, before you forget. That word again. Forget. It was a weapon they used constantly, a small hammer chipping away at my confidence. I handed the paper back. I said, I will look at it tomorrow. She took it quickly, too quickly. That small, unanswered question is where the truth begins. The next morning, I drove to the library. I told them I was going to meet a friend for coffee. I did not have a friend meeting me. I had an appointment with a lawyer I found in the phone book. His name was Mr. Henderson. He was older than me, with white hair and thick glasses. His office smelled like old books and lemon polish. I sat in his office and told him everything. I told him about the pills. I told him about the mail. I told him about the power of attorney form. He listened without interrupting. He took notes on a yellow legal pad. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair. He said, Mrs. Gable, have you heard of guardianship fraud? I shook my head. He said, it is when family members petition the court to declare an elder incompetent. Then they take control of the finances. Sometimes they put the elder in a facility. Sometimes the elder disappears from the records entirely. I felt the blood drain from my face. I said, my son would not do that. Mr. Henderson looked at me kindly. He said, stress makes people do things they never thought possible, especially when money is involved. How much equity is in your house? I told him. I told him about the savings account Robert left me. I told him about the investments. He wrote down the numbers. He said, that is a significant amount, enough to motivate a family conspiracy. I left his office with a plan. I was not going to sign anything. I was not going to confront them yet. I needed proof. I needed to hear them say it. Because what happened next changed everything I believed about my son. I drove home slowly. I watched the trees pass by the window. They were losing their leaves. The branches looked bare. They looked like bones against the grey sky. I thought about the equity in the house. Mr. Henderson had said it was significant. I had never thought about the house as money. I had thought about it as home. I had thought about it as the place where David learned to walk, I had thought about it as the place where Robert died. But to them, it was just an asset. It was just a number on a spreadsheet. It was just something to be liquidated. I pulled into the driveway. The house looked the same as it always did. The brick was red, the shutters were black, the lawn was green. But it felt different. It felt like a bank vault. It felt like a prize. I turned off the engine. I sat in the car for a moment. I looked at the steering wheel. My hands were gripping it tightly. My knuckles were white. I took a deep breath. I let go of the wheel. I opened the door. I stepped out onto the pavement. The air was cool. It smelled like rain. I walked to the front door. I put my key in the lock. I turned it. I walked inside. The house was quiet. Sarah was not in the kitchen. David was not in the office. I went to the living room. I sat in my armchair. I looked at the vase on the bookshelf. It was blue and white. It had flowers in it. The flowers were fake. They never died. They never changed. I looked at the vase. I had an idea. It was a dangerous idea. It was a necessary idea. I stood up. I walked to the hallway closet. I found the box where I kept the Christmas decorations. I dug through the ornaments. I found what I was looking for. It was small. It was black. It was a camera. I had bought it years ago to watch the front porch. I had never used it. I took it out of the box. I held it in my hand. It was light. It was powerful. I went back to the living room. I took the flowers out of the vase. I placed the camera inside. I adjusted the angle. I pointed it at the sofa. I pointed it at the doorway. I turned it on. The little light blinked green. I put the flowers back in. They hid the lens perfectly. I stepped back. I looked at the vase. It looked normal. It looked innocent. But it was watching. It was waiting. I smiled. I touched the petals of the fake roses. They felt like silk. They felt like a lie. Just like everything else in this house. I went to the kitchen to make dinner. I hummed a song while I chopped the vegetables. I hummed the song Robert used to sing to me. It was an old song. It was about love and loss. I sang it softly. I sang it for myself. I sang it for the camera. I sang it for the truth. Because the truth was coming. And it was going to be loud. I bought the camera at a small electronics store downtown. I paid in cash. I told the clerk it was for monitoring my garden. He did not ask questions. I hid it inside a ceramic vase on the bookshelf. The vase had been a gift from David for my birthday 10 years ago. It was ironic that it would now be the witness to his betrayal. The lens was small. It looked like a decorative hole in the porcelain. I tested the angle from my armchair. It captured the entire living room. It captured the doorway to the kitchen. It captured the spot where they sat to talk after dinner. I turned it on every evening before I went upstairs. I charged the batteries every morning while I pretended to read the newspaper. For 2 weeks, I recorded nothing but television noise and quiet conversation. I began to doubt myself. Maybe Mr. Henderson was wrong. Maybe I was just paranoid. Maybe the pills were making me suspicious. Then came the night of the storm. The power flickered twice before going out completely. David and Sarah lit candles in the living room. They sat close together on the sofa. The children were asleep upstairs. The house was dark except for the dancing shadows on the wall. I was in my room, listening through the baby monitor I had repurposed as an audio receiver. The signal was clear. I heard David sigh. He said, "We can't wait much longer. The doctor is asking questions." Sarah whispered quietly. "I think it is time," she said. "The paperwork is ready. Henderson filed the motion yesterday." My heart stopped. Henderson was my lawyer, not theirs. I realized then they had found another lawyer, someone else. David said, "What about the camera?" Sarah laughed. "It is a soft sound, cold." She said, "She doesn't know how to use technology, David. She thinks the television is complicated. The vase is dust. She hasn't touched it in years." They talked for another 20 minutes. They discussed the value of the house. They discussed the cost of the care facility. They discussed how much money would be left after the fees. They spoke about me like I was already gone, like I was already a memory. I sat in the dark in my bedroom. I did not cry. I felt something other than grief. Clarity. I realized something I hadn't known I was ready to understand. They were not my family anymore. They were strangers living in my house. The storm outside grew worse. The wind howled against the windows. The rain beat against the glass. It sounded like the house was breathing hard. It sounded like it was trying to warn me. But I did not need a warning. I had the truth. I had the recording. I had the evidence. I got up from the chair. I walked to the window. I looked out at the dark yard. The trees were bending in the wind. The branches were scratching against the siding. I thought about the camera in the vase. I thought about the files on the memory card. I thought about the court hearing that was coming. I thought about David's face when he realized I knew. I thought about Sarah's smile when she thought she had won. I wanted to see that smile disappear. I wanted to see the fear in their eyes. I wanted them to know that I was not weak. I wanted them to know that I was not confused. I was awake. I was aware. And I was ready. I turned away from the window. I walked to my desk. I opened the drawer. I took out the USB drives I had bought. I labelled them with a marker. I wrote evidence on each one. I wrote date and time. I wrote names. I put them in an envelope. I sealed the envelope. I put it in my purse. I locked the purse. I put the key in my pocket. I sat down on the bed. I waited for the storm to pass. I waited for the morning. I waited for the next move. Because I knew now that the game was almost over. I knew that the checkmate was coming. And I knew that I was the one holding the queen. The thunder rolled overhead. It shook the floorboards. It shook the pictures on the wall. It shook the foundation of the house. But it did not shake me. I was solid. I was steady. I was ready. The rain stopped. The wind died down. The house was quiet again. But it was a different quiet. It was the quiet before the storm breaks. It was the quiet before the truth comes out. I lay back on the pillow. I closed my eyes. I slept for the first time in weeks. I slept because I knew I was safe. I slept because I knew I was strong. I slept because I knew that tomorrow was going to be a very long day. And I was going to win. The next morning, I drove to the bank downtown. I told David I was going to buy groceries. I told Sarah I needed fresh air. They did not question me. Why would they? They thought I was confused. They thought I could not navigate the streets of my own city. I drove my old sedan carefully. I kept to the speed limit. I watched the mirrors. No one was following me. The bank was a large stone building with high columns. It smelled of marble and money. I walked to the counter where Mrs. Higgins worked. She had been my teller for 20 years. She knew Robert. She knew David when he was a boy. She looked at me over her glasses. She said, "It is good to see you, Mrs. Gable. You do not come in often anymore." I said, "My son handles things now." Her face changed, just slightly. A tightening around the eyes, a pause in her hands. She said, "I see." She looked at the computer screen. She typed quietly. Then she lowered her voice. She said, "Mrs. Gable, there was a withdrawal last week. $5,000. Cash. The signature on the slip does not match our records." I felt a coldness spread through my chest. It was not shock. It was confirmation. I said, "May I see it?" She slid the paper across the counter. I looked at the signature. It said, Joan Gable. But the J was too looped. The G was too sharp. I never loop my J. Robert taught me to write clearly. He said clear writing means a clear mind. I looked at Mrs. Higgins. I said, "That is not my hand." She nodded slowly. She said, "I thought so. I flagged it in the system, but I cannot stop it without proof. They have power of attorney pending." I said, "Not yet." She said, "Then be careful. They are watching the account alerts." I took the slip. I put it in my purse. I said, "Thank you, Martha." She smiled. It was a sad smile. I walked out of the bank. The sun was bright. The street was busy. People were walking dogs. People were drinking coffee. Life was going on, but my life was being drained away. $5,000 at a time. I sat in my car. I looked at the slip again. I thought about what that money could buy. It could buy a month of care. It could buy a new roof. It could buy silence. They were buying silence. They were paying for the doctor. They were paying for the lawyer. They were using my money to take my life. I started the engine. I drove home. I did not buy groceries. I went straight to the house. I parked in the driveway. I looked at the front door. It looked like a mouth waiting to swallow me. I got out of the car. I walked up the path. I put the key in the lock. I went inside. The house was quiet. I went to the kitchen. I opened the trash can. I looked for the deposit slips. I looked for the envelopes. I found nothing. They were cleaning up too well. But I knew where they kept the files. I knew where David kept his briefcase. It was in the office. I waited until evening. I waited until they were asleep. Then I went to work. Something about the way Mrs. Higgins looked at me made my chest tighten. She knew. And knowing meant I was not alone. But it also meant the clock was ticking. 3 days later, Sarah brought me another form. It was during lunch. We were eating soup. The children were at school. David was at work. It was just us. She placed the paper on the table next to my bowl. She said, "The insurance company needs this updated. Just a signature, Mum. It is standard." I put down my spoon. I put on my glasses. I looked at the paper. It was not insurance. It was a transfer of deed. It said I was gifting the house to David for $1. My hand shook. Not from fear, from anger. I made it shake on purpose. I said, "My hands are so clumsy today." The pen slipped. I made a mark on the table. Sarah sighed. She said, "Let me help you." She reached for my hand. Her skin was cold. Her grip was tight. She tried to guide the pen. I pulled away. I said, "I need to read it first. Robert always said, read everything." She stopped. Her smile vanished. She said, "There is no time to read, Mum. The deadline is today." I looked at her. I said, "Then I will miss the deadline. I am tired." I stood up. I left the soup on the table. I walked to the living room. I sat in my armchair. I could feel her standing in the doorway. She was watching me. I could feel her frustration. It radiated off her like heat. She said, "You are being difficult, Joan." I looked at her. I said, "I am being careful." She turned and walked away. She slammed the kitchen door. The sound echoed through the house. I waited 10 minutes, then I went to the kitchen. The paper was still on the table. I took it. I folded it. I put it in my apron pocket. Later, I went to the trash bin outside. I dug through the bags. I found the draft she had thrown away. It was crumpled. It was stained with coffee. I smoothed it out. It had notes in the margin, written in David's handwriting. It said, "If she refuses, move to Plan B." Plan B was circled. I did not know what Plan B was, but I knew I did not want to find out. I took the paper inside. I put it with the bank slip. I put them in the safe behind the painting in the hall. Robert had installed that safe 40 years ago. Only he and I knew the combination. David did not know. Sarah did not know. It was my secret. It was my armor. I stood back and looked at the painting. It was a landscape of a lake. Robert painted it himself. It was not good, but I loved it. Now it guarded my life. I touched the frame. I said, "Hold on, Robert. Just a little longer." That small detail didn't seem important at the time. It would later change everything. I went to see Mr. Henderson again on Friday. The sky was grey. It looked like rain. His office was warm. He had a pot of coffee on the desk. He poured me a cup. He said, "It is black." I said, "That is how Robert liked it." He smiled. He said, "He sounds like a wise man." I said, "He was." I took the papers out of my bag. I gave him the bank slip. I gave him the deed draft. I gave him the notes from my notebook. He read them slowly. He did not speak. When he finished, he took off his glasses. He said, "Mrs. Gable, this is criminal. This is not just civil fraud. This is theft. This is forgery." I said, "What do we do?" He said, "We build a case. We need more. We need them to admit it. We need the recording." I said, "I have the recording." I gave him the USB drive. He put it in his computer. He watched the video. He watched David pouring the pills. He watched Sarah laughing about the technology. He watched them counting the money. He paused the video. He looked at me. He said, "Where did you get this?" I said, "My living room." He said, "This is enough to stop the hearing, but it is enough to send them to prison. Are you ready for that?" I thought about David. I thought about the boy who scraped his knee. I thought about the man who stole my signature. I said, "They made their choice. I am just answering." He nodded. He said, "Then we fight." He called someone on the phone. He said, I need a forensic handwriting expert. Yes. Today. He hung up. He said the doctor who signed the petition. His name is Dr. Evans. He specializes in geriatric assessments. But he has a history. He has signed 50 petitions in the last year. 50. That is too many. He is being paid per signature. I felt sick. I said, "He never met me." Mr. Henderson said, "I know, but we need to prove he was paid. We need the money trail." I said, "I can get that." He looked at me. He said, "How?" I said, "Sarah keeps the bills in the kitchen drawer, the one with the magnets." He wrote it down. He said, "Do not get caught." I said, "I am invisible to them. They do not see me. They see a burden." He said, "Use that. Being underestimated is your greatest advantage." I left his office. The rain had started. It was a light drizzle. I walked to my car. I wiped the water from the windshield. I looked at my reflection in the glass. I looked old. I looked tired. But my eyes were clear. They were sharp. I started the car. I drove home. I thought about Dr. Evans. I thought about 50 old people. I wondered where they were. I wondered if they were in homes like the one David planned for me. I wondered if they were alone. I gripped the steering wheel. I said, "Not me. I will not be one of them. I will not be a number. I will be Joan. I will be a mother. I will be a woman who fought back." The wipers moved back and forth, swish, swish, swish. It sounded like a countdown. That night, the house was quiet again. The children were at a sleepover. David was working late. Sarah was in the living room. I was in my room. I had the baby monitor on. I was drinking tea. I was waiting. At 10 o'clock, the phone rang. It was the landline in the kitchen. Sarah answered it. I turned up the volume. The voice on the other end was male. He said, "The paperwork is filed. The hearing is Monday." Sarah said, "Good. What about the transport?" The man said, "I have a private ambulance scheduled, Monday morning at 8, before the court session." Sarah said, "Why so early?" The man said, "If she is in care before the judge sees her, it looks decided. It looks like she is already gone." My heart stopped. 8 in the morning. The hearing was at 10. They planned to take me before I could speak. They planned to put me in a van and drive me away. I sat in the dark. The teacup was in my hand. It was cold. I put it on the table. I stood up. I walked to the window. I looked out at the street. It was empty. The streetlights hummed. I thought about the ambulance. I thought about the straps. I thought about the drugs. They were not going to wait for the judge. They were going to make the judge irrelevant. I went to my closet. I took out my suitcase. It was large. It was blue. I opened it on the bed. I started packing. I packed my clothes. I packed my documents. I packed the USB drives. I packed the photo of Robert. I packed the piece of wall with the height marks. I zipped it up. I put it in the corner. I hid it behind the curtains. If they came at 8, I would be ready. I would not go quietly. I went back to the monitor. Sarah was still on the phone. She said, "Yes, the jewelry too. We can sell it later. No one will know." She hung up. She walked into the kitchen. I heard the cupboard open. I heard the ice tray crack. She was drinking wine. I heard her pour. I heard her swallow. She said to herself, "It will be over soon." Her voice was tired. She sounded relieved, like she was finishing a chore, like I was a mess she was cleaning up. I turned off the monitor. I sat on the bed. I looked at the suitcase. I looked at the door. I was not afraid anymore. I was angry. Anger is a fuel. It burns hot. It burns long. I lay down. I did not sleep. I watched the clock. The hands moved slowly. 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours. The house settled. The pipes groaned. The wind blew outside. I waited for the sun. I waited for the morning. I waited for the ambulance. But I had a plan. Mr. Henderson knew. The police would know. The trap was set. They thought they were the hunters. They did not know they were the prey. And suddenly Robert's warning echoed in my mind. Paperwork matters, but timing matters more. I had the timing. I had the truth. I had the will. I closed my eyes. I rested. I needed my strength. Tomorrow was the day. Tomorrow everything would change. The next morning I woke up at 6. The sun was not up yet. The house was dark. I got dressed. I wore my navy suit. I wore my sturdy shoes. I put the purse over my shoulder. It was heavy with the evidence. I went downstairs. The kitchen was empty. The suitcase was still hidden. I made coffee. I sat at the table. I waited. At 7:30, David came down. He wore a suit. He looked nervous. He said, "Good morning, Mum. You are up early?" I said I could not sleep. He nodded. He poured coffee. He did not drink it. He looked at his watch. He said, "Sarah is bringing the kids home. We need to talk later." I said, "About what?" He said, "About the future. About what is best." I said, "I know what is best." He looked at me. His eyes were hard. He said, "You might not be able to decide soon." I said, "We will see." He walked away. He went to the living room. He checked his phone. He paced. Sarah arrived at 7:45. She looked rushed. She said, "The car is outside." I said, "What car?" She said, "Just in case, for the appointment." I said, "I have no appointment." She smiled. It was a tight smile. She said, "You will remember later. You are confused." I stood up. I said, "I am not confused. I am ready." She looked at David. They exchanged a glance. It was the same glance from the dinner table, the confirmation. They thought it was time. They thought I was weak. They walked to the door. They opened it. I heard an engine outside. It was a large engine, a diesel engine. It idled loudly. It sounded like a truck. It sounded like an ambulance. I walked to the window. I looked out. A white van was parked in the driveway. 2 men in uniforms were standing by the back door. They held a stretcher. They looked at the house. They looked at their watches. David opened the front door. He said, "They are here, Mum. Time to go." I looked at him. I did not move. I said, "No." He stepped forward. He said, "You do not have a choice." I said, "I have every choice." I walked to the hallway. I walked to the painting. I moved it aside. I opened the safe. I took out the envelope. I held it up. I said, "Mr. Henderson is waiting at the courthouse. The police are on their way." The van engine stopped. The men outside looked at each other. David froze. He said, "What are you talking about?" I said, "I recorded everything. I have the forgery. I have the bribes. I have the plan. Sarah stepped back. She said, "You are bluffing." I said, "Am I?" I walked to the door. I opened it. The air was cold. The men looked at me. I said, "Do not come in. This is private property." David yelled, "You cannot stop this." I looked at him. I said, "Watch me." The silence stretched. It was heavy. It was thick. Then I heard a siren. It was far away, but it was coming closer. It was getting louder. David looked at the street. His face went white. Sarah dropped her keys. They clattered on the floor. The sound was loud in the quiet hall. I stood there. I held the envelope. I held my ground. I said, "You wanted a scene, David. You got one." The siren wailed. It was right outside. Red and blue lights flashed against the wall. The doorbell rang. It was not the ambulance. It was the police. And that small, unanswered question is where the truth begins. The door opened before David could reach for the handle. 2 officers stood on the porch. They wore dark uniforms with badges that caught the light from the hallway. The rain had stopped, but the air was still wet. It smelled of ozone and wet pavement. The older officer stepped inside. He said, "We received a call regarding potential elder abuse and unlawful detainment." He looked at David. He looked at Sarah. Then he looked at me. He said, "Are you Joan Gable?" I said, "Yes, I am." He nodded. He said, "Are you safe here?" I said, "I am now." David stepped forward. He said, "This is a misunderstanding. She is confused. She needs medical attention." The officer turned to him. He said, "Sir." Step back. He put his hand on his belt. It was not a threat, it was a boundary. Sarah began to cry. She said, "We were trying to help her. She is not well. She is dangerous to herself." The officer looked at the ambulance outside. He said, "Why is there a private medical transport here for a routine checkup?" David opened his mouth. He closed it. He had no answer. I stood in the hallway. I held the envelope against my chest. It felt warm from my hand. I watched my son. He looked smaller than he had yesterday. The suit did not fit him anymore. The confidence was gone. He was just a man caught in a lie. The officer asked for identification. David gave it slowly. His hand shook. Sarah wiped her eyes. The makeup was smudged. She looked tired. She looked old. I felt a pang of pity, but I did not move. Pity does not protect you. Truth protects you. The officer radioed for backup. He said, "We need a supervisor." He said, "We need a medical examiner." He was taking this seriously. I walked to the living room. I sat in my armchair. I placed the envelope on the table. I said, "Everything you need is in there." The officer looked at the envelope. He said, "We will review it." He looked at David. He said, "You are not to leave the premises." David sat on the sofa. He put his head in his hands. Sarah stood by the window. She looked out at the van. The men from the ambulance were gone. They had seen the police. They had driven away. They were not paid to be heroes. They were paid to be ghosts. The house was quiet again, but it was a different quiet. It was the quiet of authority. It was the quiet of justice. I looked at the clock. It was 8:15. The hearing was at 10. We had time. I looked at David. He looked up. His eyes were red. He said, "Mom, why?" I said, "Because you left me no choice." He shook his head. He said, "We loved you." I said, "Love does not steal. Love does not drug. Love does not hide paperwork in drawers." He flinched at the word paperwork. He knew what it meant. He knew Robert used to say it. He knew I was using his own weapon against him. The officer stood by the door. He watched us. He was waiting for the lawyer. He was waiting for the final piece. I took a breath. The air tasted like dust and rain. It tasted like freedom. I looked at my hands. They were steady. They were not shaking anymore. The fog was lifting. The world was coming into focus. I was not a patient. I was not a burden. I was a woman in her own home. And I was done being afraid. Something about the way the officer stood made my chest tighten. He was protecting me. But I had already protected myself. He was just the period at the end of the sentence I had written. I waited. I watched the driveway. I waited for Mr. Henderson. I knew he was coming. I knew he had the rest of the files. I knew this was not over until the judge signed the dismissal. But for now, the ambulance was gone. The police were here, and I was still in my chair. That was victory enough for the moment. Mr. Henderson arrived 20 minutes later. He carried a leather briefcase. He looked calm. He looked like a man who had won many battles. He shook hands with the officer. He handed over a stack of papers. He said, "This is the emergency motion to dismiss the guardianship petition." He said, "This is the evidence of fraud." He said, "This is the video recording." The officer took the papers. He looked at the USB drive. He said, "We will log this as evidence." He looked at David. He said, "You need to come with us. There are questions to answer." David stood up. He looked at me. He said, "Mom, tell them to stop. Tell them I was helping." I looked at him. I said, "I cannot lie for you, David. Not anymore." He stepped toward me. The officer stepped between us. He said, "Sir, do not approach her." David stopped. He clenched his fists. He said, "You are destroying this family. You are choosing money over us." I stood up. I walked to him. I stopped just out of reach. I said, "I am choosing myself over you. There is a difference. Family is not a transaction. You cannot spend me like cash. You cannot sign me away like a deed." Sarah spoke from the window. She said, "You will be alone, Joan. You are old. You will need help. Who will come when you fall?" I looked at her. I said, "I would rather fall alone than be held down by people who call themselves family." She turned away. She covered her face. But I did not hear sorrow in her breathing. I heard calculation. She was already thinking about the damage control. She was already thinking about the lawyers she would need. I went back to my chair. I sat down. Mr. Henderson sat next to me. He said, "You did well, Joan. You were very brave." I said, "I was not brave. I was scared." But I did not move. He said, "That is what bravery is, not the absence of fear. It is acting in spite of it." The officer radioed for a transport vehicle. He said, they would not take the ambulance. They would take a patrol car. David was read his rights. He did not look at me when they put the handcuffs on. He looked at the floor. Sarah was not arrested yet. She was a witness for now. But I knew the video implicated her too. I knew she would not escape the consequences. The house felt empty as they walked out. The front door opened. The cool air came in. Then it closed. The lock clicked. The sound was final. It was the sound of a chapter ending. I looked at Mr. Henderson. I said, "Is it over?" He said, "The criminal case will take time. The civil case will take time. But the guardianship is stopped. You are safe." I nodded. I felt tired. The adrenaline was fading. My bones felt heavy. I said, "Thank you." He said, "Rest now. I will handle the rest." He stood up. He put his hand on my shoulder. It was a gentle weight. He left. I was alone in the house. The silence returned. But it was not the heavy silence of grief. It was the quiet silence of peace. I looked at the envelope on the clerk table. It was still there. I opened it. I took out the pieces of paper. I looked at the forged signature. I looked at the bank slip. I looked at the petition. They were just paper. They could not hurt me anymore. I put them back in the envelope. I sealed it. I would keep it, not as a weapon, but as a reminder. A reminder that I survived. A reminder that I fought. I stood up. I walked to the kitchen. I made a cup of tea. I sat at the table where David had eaten breakfast this morning. The chair was empty. The cup was washed. It was like he had never been here. But I knew he had been. I knew the scars were real. I knew the healing would take time. But I was ready. I drank the tea. It was hot. It warmed me from the inside. I looked out the window. The sun was coming out. The clouds were breaking. The light hit the lawn. It looked green. It looked alive. I smiled. It was a small smile, but it was mine. The weeks that followed were busy. The police interviewed me 3 times. They asked about the pills. They asked about the money. They asked about the threats. I answered every question. I did not hide anything. I gave them the notebook. I gave them the USB drives. I gave them the piece of wall with the height marks. They said that was not evidence. I said, it is evidence of who I was before they tried to erase me. They put it in the file anyway. David pleaded guilty to fraud. He was sentenced to 5 years. Sarah pleaded guilty to conspiracy. She was sentenced to 3 years. They lost their licenses. They lost their house. They lost everything they tried to take from me. I did not feel happy about their punishment. I felt sad. I felt a hollow space where a mother's love used to be. But I knew it was necessary. Justice is not about revenge. It is about balance. I stayed in the house on Elm Street. I hired a housekeeper named Maria. She came twice a week. She was kind. She did not try to manage me. She just cleaned. She asked about my day. I told her about my garden. I told her about my books. We drank coffee together. She became a friend, not a caretaker, a friend. I joined a book club at the library. I met people my age. We talked about history. We talked about travel. We talked about life. I was not the confused old woman anymore. I was Joan. I was the woman who stood up. I was the woman who won. Sometimes people asked me what happened. They heard rumors. They heard about the arrest. I told them the truth. I said, my son tried to take my life. I stopped him. They looked at me with respect. They looked at me with fear. But I did not mind. I knew who I was. I cleaned out the office. I removed David's desk. I put Robert's desk back in its place. I sat there sometimes. I opened the drawers. I found his old pens. I found his old maps. I found a note he had written me. It was tucked inside a drawer. It said, "Joan, you are stronger than you know. Trust yourself." I cried when I found it. I cried because he knew. He knew I would need to hear it. He knew I would face a storm. I put the note on the wall. I framed it. I looked at it every morning. It gave me strength. It gave me purpose. I realized something I hadn't known I was ready to understand. Grief does not end. It changes shape. It becomes part of you. It becomes the foundation you stand on. I was not the same woman who started this journey. I was harder. I was wiser. I was freer. I walked through the house. I touched the walls. I touched the paint. I touched the memories. They were safe. They were mine. No one could take them now. No one could sign them away. I went to the bank. I changed the passwords. I changed the accounts. I made sure no one could ever touch my money without my permission. Mrs. Higgins smiled at me. She said, "You look well, Mrs. Gable." I said, "I am well, Martha. I am finally well." She nodded. She said, "I am glad." We talked for a few minutes, then I left. I walked out into the sunlight. The air was crisp. It smelled like autumn. It smelled like new beginnings. I got in my car. I drove home. I parked in the driveway. I looked at the house. It was red brick. It was solid. It was mine. I got out, walked to the door. I put the key in the lock. I turned it. I went inside. I locked the door behind me. I was safe. I was home. It has been 1 year since that morning. The leaves are falling again. The trees are bare. The wind is cold. But I am warm. I sit in my armchair. I look at the vase on the bookshelf. The camera is gone now. I do not need it anymore. I put real flowers in the vase. They are red roses. They smell sweet. They remind me of life. They remind me of growth. I think about David. I wonder if he thinks about me. I hope he learns. I hope he understands what he lost. But I cannot control that. I can only control myself. I can only live my life. I have started writing my own story. I write down my memories. I write down Robert's jokes. I write down the things I learned. I will leave it for Leo and Mia. They are grown now. They know the truth. They came to see me last month. They cried. They said they were sorry. They said they did not know. I believed them. They were children in this too. They were used by their parents. I hugged them. I told them I loved them. I told them they are welcome here, always, but on their own terms, not as caretakers, not as managers, as family, as guests, as loved ones. They left with copies of my will. It is clear now. It is fair. It is signed. It is witnessed. Paperwork matters. Robert was right. It matters because it protects the truth. It protects the people. It protects the legacy. I look at the clock. It is time for my tea. I stand up. My legs are strong. My back is straight. I walk to the kitchen. I put the kettle on. I watch the steam rise. I think about the journey. I think about the pain. I think about the victory. It was not easy. It was not clean. But it was mine. I earned it. I fought for it. I kept it. If this story touched you, tell me in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is there right now. Like the video and subscribe. I want to know you are there. I want to know you are listening. Because sometimes knowing someone else is listening makes all the difference. You are not alone. There are people who care. There are people who will help. But you must be willing to speak. You must be willing to stand. You must be willing to protect what is yours. Not just the money, not just the house, but your dignity, your voice, your life. Do not let anyone take it. Do not let anyone sign it away. You are valuable. You are worthy. You are enough. I am Joan Gable. I am 73 years old. I am a widow. I am a mother. I am a survivor. And I am still here. The sun is rising. The paper is waiting. The pen is in your hand. Write your own ending. Make it a good one. Make it one that Robert would be proud of. Make it one that you can live with. Because in the end, that is all that matters. Not the money, not the house, not the papers. It is the way you stand when the wind blows. It is the way you speak when the room is quiet. It is the way you love when you have been hurt. I am still learning. I am still standing. And I am still here. Thank you for listening. Thank you for believing. Now go and tell your truth.